I'm Spencer Bailey. This is Time Sensitive. Hey everyone, this week I'm in conversation with the photographer Tina Barney, who for over 40 years has become internationally renowned for capturing her particular milieus. Family, friends, and neighbors in Watch Hill, Rhode Island, most notably, but also in New York and Sun Valley, Idaho. Tina has never seemed interested in overt social commentary. Rather, like an ethnographer, she captures people and places, routines and rituals from the world that surrounds her, and with a rigorous, studied eye and a distinctive formalism. Tina brings a sense of beauty and theater to her work, and looking at her photographs is a pleasure. It's clear as a viewer that she simply enjoys making pictures, and that she has the rare ability to create a profound sense of intimacy with her subjects. In a world awash with images, Tina's stand out for their rich colors and deep focus, as well as for how they distill the dynamics of the communities across multiple generations that have been her focus. The thing I especially enjoy about Tina's work is that even though it's the people in her pictures that are often the focal point, it's the scenes that surround them that are often just as, if not more, interesting. Prior to this interview, I'd gotten to spend a bit of time with Tina, but we've never been able to sit down for a conversation quite like this. We spoke about everything from her new Radius book, The Beginning, and corresponding Casman Gallery show, to the small miracles that can exist within a single photograph. Before we jump into it, I'd first like to thank our Season 7 presenting sponsor, L'École School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels. In addition to its various courses, exhibitions, publications, and research projects, L'École also offers a new look at the world of jewelry through online talks that bring together two experts for a roughly 45-minute conversation. These talks are then followed by a Q&A session, during which attendees can submit their own questions. Held in French and English and simultaneously interpreted in Cantonese, Mandarin, and Japanese, the talks are later available for viewing on YouTube. Participating in these conversations allows attendees to join a community of curious enthusiasts eager to discover and learn. The next L'École talk, upcoming soon, is on precious ornamental stones. You can learn more about L'École and join its live online conversations at www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. And now, here's my conversation with Tina. Hi, Tina. Welcome to Time Sensitive.
Hey, Spencer. How are you? Great to be here.
So I wanted to start today on a specific subject, the eyes. You've written to better understand the difference between photography and painting. I had my portrait painted in the late 1980s, which took months. I realized that the most interesting difference between the two methods is in the eyes of the subject. In a finished painting, the eyes are an accumulation of the time it took to make the portrait, as opposed to in a photograph where they are the result of the fraction of a second it took to press the cable release. I was hoping you might elaborate a little bit on this and talk about the power of the eyes in a photograph, the relationship of that to the rapid speed at which the photograph is taken.
Thank you for choosing that, because I don't know where you found that, but it is so interesting that I haven't thought about it even enough. But now that we've got time here, I'd like to. So let's just say, in order to pose for a portrait, and let's just think about the portraits that have been made throughout the history of art. And if you look into the eyes of the subject, what's in those eyes and how much is in eyes? Can you read a person through their eyes? And why can you? Let's say you don't see the nose or you don't see the hair or the lips. And if you isolated the eyes, could you really read what that person's saying or thinking or feeling? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a great question. So the painting is an accumulation of the time it took to make that painting. A photograph is a 30th of a second, a 15th of a second, etc. Then why in the eyes can you tell what's going on? I actually don't know the answer to that. And I also think that there's no way that the viewer can isolate all the other parts of the human being, not only in their bodies, what they're wearing, and the surroundings of where they're sitting or where they're standing, to isolate the eyes that much so that the eyes tell the whole story. So I don't know the answer, but I just think it's fascinating to think about.
And how do you think about eyes specifically in your own work, in the pictures you've taken?
Well, I'm thinking about all those things. And, depending on the kind of camera, there's so much you can see. And whether the person's wearing glasses or what the lighting is like. And I don't think I think about them specifically by themselves. But a lot of the times when I take a picture, and a lot's going on an awful lot of the time, I tell the subject to look into the lens, not at the lens, but into the lens. And I refer back to that because once I read an article about Betty Davis. You can't believe how many young students have never heard of Betty Davis when I tell this story. I hope you have heard of Betty Davis. But at one point, someone wrote about Betty Davis and the power that she had as an actress, and they said that Betty Davis had the ability to look right through the camera out through the other end. And I don't know if that has to do with what the photographer was saying to her or the concentration that she had. But I think it has to do with concentration. It has to do with maybe what's going on in the brain that comes out through the eyes.
Makes me think of your sister, Jill.
And Jill wears glasses a lot of the time, but I think it also has to do with those photographs of Jill are, I think, powerful and intimate because I know her so well. And also, I've often mentioned why I go back to the same subjects more than once. And it has to do with those subjects. Let's say Sheila is the other one, Sheila and Jill, because they know who they are. And what I mean by that is that person or that subject has a very strong sense of themselves without being affected by anything, that there's no crap, that there's no bullshit. They might have a hard life. They might have had a hard day, but they still know who they are. And again, that's hard to find.
I should mention here that for around 25 years now, unbeknownst to, I think, most people who are familiar with your work, you've been drawing and painting snapshots of your family and your work, pastels, watercolors, crayon and pencil drawings. How do you think about your time spent drawing and painting versus making pictures? And could you speak about the role of the eyes in those drawings?
Well, first of all, I am such an amateur painter that I don't even know if I even can draw eyes or paint eyes. And I don't think of them actually a lot because I think I'm thinking of the whole exterior, what the people are wearing. But I choose the photograph because there's something that draws me to it. And I actually don't make them very big. The biggest I've made is 11 by 14. So I don't think I really concentrate on painting the eyes because the eyes are so difficult to do. I think that what interests me about making those drawings or watercolors is that I'm doing them all from looking at one of my photographs I've made, is that I look at that photograph in depth more than any time in which I've made it. And that part I like. It's really thinking about that person. It's like touching that person. It's very intimate. It's like spending time with that person. So those are the other reasons I like it. There's also that feeling of a rush. And I get that rush from photographing with that instant of pushing the cable release. And the rush in painting comes from just a stroke or one little tiny second in which I'm making a brush stroke that I know is pleasurable or what I wanted it to be.
Of taking pictures, you've said you rarely spend more than an hour with your subjects. Sometimes you never even see them again. How do you think about this, like, shoot time, if I could call it that, the short period of time you have to create the thing that then lasts for a long time, potentially eternity?
Well, I don't think about the eternity part, believe me, but I think anybody that knows me, or maybe they don't know how fast I do things. And it's really bullet fast. And I think if you ask people that I've worked with on a fashion shoot, they all know. It's literally, I walk into a room, and I think if you took maybe 60 seconds, maybe maybe 2 minutes at the max. I roll my eyes around and it's like darts. I say, okay, that's good, that's good, that's good. And so I don't think about the fact that that's going to last long. But what I'm getting at again is it's almost like devouring something. It's almost like when you're hungry and you see a great buffet table laid out and you just like, oh, I want one of those, I want one of those, I want one of those. And you just start putting the stuff on your plate and you're just devouring it. And that's really what it's like. It's fast and quick and it's greedy. It's just trying to get at that rush of the capture, which I think most photographers are searching for.
How do you, I guess, get into that headspace? Because I imagine it requires a tremendous amount of energy.
Well, first of all, from the second I wake up in the morning, I have that energy. I'm that kind of person. But the part that's difficult is sometimes I go on to a place, a location, and that could be for my own work or it could be for a job. And what turns me on isn't there. You know, it's like going to a party when you're looking for romance and the person isn't there. You look through the bar and they're just not there. It's just like that. And so that's discouraging. But what I've learned, I mean, let's say I've traveled all the way to China or India to photograph, and I know that's my time. I can't go back. And I've learned to be patient, which is very hard for me, and that if I sit there and think about it and work at it, I can make something come. A lot of times I know right away, this is not going to happen. So it's kind of hit or miss.
You said your definition of quality has to do with the time and care that's put into the making of things. I was hoping you might speak to this making aspect of your work. What to you makes a quality photograph?
It's going to take a minute to think because for my own work, you mean?
Yeah.
I think that, well, of course, it gets harder and harder as time goes by, almost because I feel as if I've done everything. But I think that I've mentioned over and over again when I get asked about what I do, that the formal parts of putting a picture together is the part that excites me the most. And I realize that the word formal is becoming extinct because most people I talk to don't know what that means. I learned that word maybe from the photography classes I took, maybe from Jan Groover, the photographer who I made a film on, whose sort of mantra was formalism is everything. And so let's just say that to me, formalism is the structural parts that make up a photograph or make up a work of art, how it's put together, that has to do with scale, space, light, and form. All the things you think most artists would be looking for. Now, in a minimalistic work of a painter, I don't know where that form comes from. I don't know enough about making other kinds of work. But for me, it's that. And that sometimes there are things that can happen that I might not have done before. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are the things that have to do with quality. It doesn't have to do with finding the right subject, and yet sometimes that is key. It's the things that surround that subject that really are very important to me, and almost more important to that than the subject itself, the human subject.
Well, it's a great segue because I did want to circle back to something you were mentioning earlier, which is this durational quality of your work and these subjects you've photographed time and again. Your sister Jill, your brother Philip, your sons Tim and Phil, your friends Susan, Sheila, and Kik. What's it been like for you to shoot these subjects so intimately across decades, this sort of across time element of the pictures?
I think that to answer that is so profound that I don't think I can answer it myself. And it really has to do with how much you love somebody. And how can you mark that? How can you tell somebody? How can you show somebody in a lifetime as a human being? You know, you can give them presents. You can build the Taj Mahal. I mean, we can think of the things that people do for love, and it's just not enough. It's just not enough. People write books, and we know that they're books that show that. They make movies. And so it's sort of a, not unscripted, but an automatic practice that I just started and kept doing. And then I was thinking of the ease of using the same subjects, and that I get to do what I want to do because I know that those subjects are easy to work with and they're not inhibited. So it has a lot to do with all those different things, plus the fascination of watching things change through time. And this comes from my teacher, Mark Klett, who made a project called the Photographic Survey, in which he and his partners, Ellen Manchester, Joanne Verberg, etc., went back to where Jackson and O'Sullivan, the photographers, photographed landscape in the same place at the same time, because Mark was a geologist, actually marked by watching the sun, etc., exactly the same place at the same time, maybe more than once at a time. And that had to do with following something through time and seeing the change through time. And I think that really made a big imprint on me.
While we're in this part of the conversation, I have to bring up the pictures of Marina and her father, Peter, starting with Marina's room in 1987, then another photograph in 1990, and a third in 1997. I think when it comes to considering time in your work, I find this trio of pictures particularly potent and powerful, even poignant. What's your perspective on time across these images? And maybe for the listeners who haven't seen it, could you describe the first image, Marina's room, and how that compares to the third one?
So Peter Tatishev was an art dealer, and he gave me my first show ever. And he had a beautiful daughter named Marina. And so I can't remember when I think it was 87 that I photographed them the first time, and I asked if I could go to their apartment. So that's how that first photograph happened. And she was on that bed. It's also the first time that I used exterior lighting. And I found an assistant who could do lighting, and he stuck a light in that closet behind them, which makes a huge difference. And she had that dress on, and the whole thing was perfect. And then I thought, why not go back and photograph them again? And the last picture was done with an 8x10. It's vertical, so that changed. And that's not as complicated as one might think. It just was the chance of going back, and definitely was very much a re-photographic survey because the room didn't change, and then she changed so much.
And Peter, too.
And Peter. Yeah, the teenage daughter smoking.
Philosophically speaking, how do you think about time in your work? And I know you alluded this when speaking to the durational quality, but I think this multi-generational context is really interesting. I mean, you've essentially been, in many respects, photographing the same small group of people in the same houses since 1976.
I love the fact that I've done that. You know, the whole part of sort of recording something historically is it's just a pleasure. But also the town I live in, I love so much. And just
Watch Hill.
Yeah, recording that and keeping that sort of recorded somehow is just a wonderful thought. And of course, that's been done through history, but I'm sitting there every day of my life and I think, okay, why not do this? But also, you know, when it comes down to it, is I really like making pictures. And I thought, okay, I have this subject matter here. And as I've said, it's easier to walk out the door and have the same people than I've gone to Europe, I've gone to China, I've gone to India, and found that those pictures in those travels, even though the Europeans was, I think, a very good body of work, still not the same as being home. It's not the same thing. So it's just a pleasure. That's what I say. I'm glad to be part of it.
Another time element, of course, is that there's the role of summertime. Most of these pictures are taken in the summer, aside from the obvious fact that it's Rhode Island in the summer. But why meditate so much on the summertime? And what is it about those particular months that seem to be sort of photographic gold for you?
Well, as I started showing my work with Janet Borden, and as sort of that ball started rolling, you sort of think, oh, good, I'd like to have another show. I'd like to get these out there in the world. And I remember the I guess you'd call it stress or the fear that it's not going to happen again. And then the waiting time, like most photographers. And I'd wait through May, I'd wait through June, and then I'd realize it was 4th of July, bam, it all starts happening. And before that, there was just nothing there. It was very quiet, very empty, and all the people start coming at the same time, and they leave at the same time. So this was the time that I had to do what I did. There's literally nobody there at the other times of the year. I mean, nobody walking down the street. I'm kind of the only person right now, for instance, living there. There are one or two other people with lights on, and that's it.
There's this profound sense of nostalgia. I would even say homesickness in your pictures. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I use that word, and nostalgia is the word I like. And I believe if you look it up in the dictionary, it's the desire to go back to a prior time, usually times that were happy, maybe sad, but is to go back. You know, it's sort of interesting to think of that feeling usually is melancholy. I mean, if you ask people, each person, what does that feel? There's usually a sadness to it because you can't retrieve that time. So maybe people make work or, write about the past to do the best they can to bring it all back without being able to in real life.
Connected to this, there's also the themes or roles of tradition and ritual, which are so central to your work. How do you see those connecting to nostalgia?
Well, I think, again, the repetition of the 4th of July, the auction, or the taking down of the American flag, or, we could think of many of them, the field day, all those things. First of all, the reason that I gravitated towards them is because my subjects would be there. And I would have a feast of being able to do many different things. But then also there's this nostalgia that it's happening again, that life goes on, that there's no end, that it keeps going. And that is a miracle to me. I still find it a miracle that people do and repeat the same things over and over and over, and they love it and they want it without many things changing whatsoever, except age. The grandparents get older, etc. Children are born and the grandparents get old.
So let's go back to your early life. Before we started this interview, we were sort of talking about this. Your maternal grandfather was an amateur photographer.
Yes.
And he took pictures at family events and introduced you to photography and the darkroom when you were little. Your father was an art collector. And then there was your mother, this incredible model who had a strong sense of style and color. I was hoping maybe you'd paint a picture of your childhood, if you can, and also talk about your stepfather, who I wasn't familiar with until you had mentioned it, who had been the editor-in-chief of Paris Match in the U.S.
Well, I think this would take about 10 hours to tell the story, and it sounds sort of as if I'd made it up. But the combination of, I think, my parents is what's interesting, because my mother is from Brooklyn. Very normal, nice, sweet family. But she decided she wanted to be a model. But at the same time, her father was an amateur photographer. So he not only brought his 4x5, and I have the 4x5 glass plate negatives, in which he brought that camera around with him. And I can't figure out, I need an historian, whether he brought it to war or brought it just to his practices as a soldier. But then he also recorded his family. And he had many different kinds of cameras. And then had his own, when he retired from the Army, little darkroom that he would drag me down under. And I wasn't interested. But he always, when he came to visit us, because we lived near them, would have about 3 cameras hanging from his neck. He had a stereo camera, and he photographed all of us. We have all those photographs. So he recorded our family. And then my mother was a model, and she continued to dress beautifully. through her whole life. And she even brought me to a French fashion show when I think I was 14, which I'll never forget. So that was sort of made a major imprint on me. And I was aware of fashion because of her. And then she became an interior decorator. So I had two sort of fantastic visual sort of influences around me. And then my stepfather, who she met and then married after she divorced my father, she met in Samoritz while skiing with my father, and he was Bulgarian. He escaped from behind the Iron Curtain, ended up in Europe, and he saw my mother in a bar at the Palace Hotel. And then they got married eventually, and I have pictures of my sister and I at their wedding. And he was a great influence because he just adored my sister and myself. So that was a very sophisticated background because I met the head of Paris magazine, who was one of the great journalists in the world, at a very young age. And I could go on and on, describe the places that I sort of was brought to, the people I met. And it was a pretty sort of multi-layered, wonderful childhood.
And at age 14, you head off to boarding school in Switzerland. Your choice. Why did you decide to leave home for Switzerland? And what was your time in Switzerland like?
Well, I don't know why. I remember going up to my father and asking him if I could go to boarding schools and him bringing home the brochures of the boarding schools. What's strange is I was such a terrible student at the school I went to in New York, the Spence School. Terrible. Like D-, not C+, D-. And I'd bring my report card to my father and he'd sort of say, oh, come on, you can do better than this. And then I decided to go off, and I don't know why. And I remember getting on a plane at 14 to go to Switzerland. And I thought, why wasn't I terrified? And I guess people did that in those days. And I went to the school. I had no idea how strict it was. I mean, like convent strict, except that I had 3 roommates, and we were not allowed to speak English. So I learned how to speak French there. And then my father died while I was there at the age of 14. He was 49. And that kind of changed our lives. And went back to Spence School to graduate from there, and then got married when I was 20. I went to college for 4 months. My mother dragged me to Europe because she thought I was going to marry the boyfriend I was going out with. That's not the person I ended up marrying. But anyway, came back and got married at 20 and had my first child at 21.
There's so much there, but I think before we jump forward a bit, I do think it's important to stay on this moment of age 14, and you're over in Europe, your father passes away. In retrospect, I'm wondering, back to the nostalgia question, the search for nostalgia in your work, losing him, that precious time with him, that's connected.
You know, I'll never know that, but now that you mention it, it might. You know, I have no idea. I've never gone to a shrink in my whole life, so now you're my first shrink that I've ever met, and you might have discovered something I never knew. Could be.
Well, back to Spence, and what an incredible few years, that little period of time where you come back, you decide, okay, I'm not going to go to college. I did want to touch on Spence, though,
wait, I have a missing link in there, too. Well, you finished what you were going to say. I forgot. There was a very important year in there.
So back to New York, at Spence, you had this incredible art history teacher named Margaret Scolari, and I wanted to mention her here because I think the story of Tina Barney couldn't really be told without Margaret. And I was hoping you might just talk a little bit about her and her long-term impact on you.
Margareta, I think that's how you pronounced it. Well, I think what's kind of strange is to believe that I was living in a house filled with Impressionist paintings that we never talked about. I knew who the artists were on the walls. I knew how to pronounce their names with the correct accent, but we never talked about them. So then I'd go back to school one day, and there's this history of art teacher who's really like a drill sergeant, kind of scary, really strict. And she starts flashing slides on the screen. And it was thrilling. And I don't think I was alone. I think all of us were thrilled. And that's all she did, was she'd flash slides on the screen and say who the people were. Now, that year, our class had a trip to Greece where we got to see some of the work that she put on the screen. So that was one thing that was very interesting. And that's all I can say is she really excited me. And it's funny to think that somebody outside of my home would excite me about art, but she did.
And I want to pause here for a big Museum of Modern Art related question. Your life has been incredibly linked to and profoundly transformed by this institution. And first there was Margarita's husband.
Margareta. Let's find out how to pronounce that. Margareta. I think it was Margareta.
Margareta's husband, Alfred Barr, who was the great director and at the Museum of Modern Art.
I think he was the first. I think we have to look that up.
Yeah, I think he was. And it's a tenuous but interesting connection to MoMA. But then there is, in the early 70s, you joined MoMA's Junior Council, for which you helped catalog prints in the museum's Department of Photography.
Oh, don't make that bigger than it was. Okay, shall I go back in there and get that chronology fixed up? Is that okay?
Yeah,
because there's some missing links. Okay. I'm in high school, 10th grade. I had Margareta Scolari as a teacher. I then graduate from Spence and come back and go to college for 4 months, where my mother dragged me out of college because she thought I was going to get married to my boyfriend. We go to Europe, I come back, and then decide to go to Florence, Italy at 19 and live there with a friend of mine who wanted to be an opera singer, and almost married an Italian. I come back, and my brother saved my life. He said, "You can't marry this guy." And then the next year I marry John Barney, American, who I met a long time ago. So that's how that sequel is. And then I have Tim at 21, and then a friend of mine, Allie Anderson, comes in and says, "Hey, would you like to work on the Junior Council voluntarily at MoMA?" So that's that sequence.
Got it. And after that, you have this big moment in 1983 with Big Pictures by Contemporary Photographers, which featured your 4x5 color print of Sunday New York Times.
Well, before that, because of that Junior Council job, I started collecting photography. I think that's interesting. There were 2 galleries, and through MoMA, they gave me the names of the galleries, and I went in and started learning about contemporary photography. And I started buying Edward Weston, Robert Frank, when you could buy them for $100 and $200. I didn't buy a lot, but that's when I became interested in photography. And then we moved to Sun Valley, Idaho.
Which we'll definitely get to.
Yeah.
I just want to stay on MoMA, though, because there was also your major 1990 solo exhibition there. And your work was also featured in a 2004 exhibition, Fashioning Fiction in Photography since 1990. I'm sure I'm leaving other things out, but the question I wanted to get to was, how do you think about MoMA across all of this time and its role in your life and career? Because it's so interesting how this one institution is this kind of decades-long through line since you were a child, basically.
Well, not a child, but let's say teenager. I think that might have to do with John Trikowski, who was the head of photography. I think it might have to do with MoMA being interested in photography, maybe more than other museums. I'm not sure, but I feel like that was true. They must have had an approachability through the Junior Council and other parts of MoMA that made it accessible when I think back of what it was like. Meeting Janet Borden was pivotal of her connection and all the photography people that she
had seen your work at a MoMA exhibition.
She saw it at Big Pictures. That's the first time she saw it. But I had been buying photographs from her as a client because she worked at Robert Frieda's gallery. So that's
and for the listeners who don't know, Janet Borden was your first gallerist.
Yes. So that's how all that happened. So that was sort of a long kind of connection to MoMA through all those different reasons.
And another pulled back question I wanted to ask, which connects to Florence, was about Italy, particularly Florence and Rome, and Italian Renaissance architecture. It's not lost on me that some of the things you were talking about earlier, color, light, proportion, framing, these are all essential aspects of your work And there are also essential aspects in Italian Renaissance architecture. Could you speak a bit to your time in Italy and also what led you to Italy specifically and how you think about this kind of quote unquote Italy time in the context of your work?
Well, I think you're reading more into it than what really happened. But the reason I got to Florence was I had a very good friend that I grew up with who wanted to be an opera singer. Her name was Estelle McGowan, and she went over to Florence and lived with an Italian family. And I said, okay, I'll come too. And that's how that happened. And through that Italian family, they hired for me a little old lady that I went out with, and I feel like it was once a week, maybe twice a week, and she would take me to all the great, not only museums, but little sort of churches in Florence by myself to teach me about the Italian or the Florentine Renaissance. And I even made 2 books, all written in Italian, and kept postcards of everything she showed me, and did that all on my own. And then the rest of the time I was with this boyfriend. So it was a pretty good combination. I didn't think about that Florentine Renaissancean background when I made photographs. It really was more the study of Caravaggio and space and those Italian artists that influenced me. So I don't know. I think just being there and speaking the language was wonderful, but it sort of stayed there. I don't think I went further than that.
And you went back to Italy in 1996 as a visiting artist at the American Academy in Rome.
And that was sort of separate from the Florentine connection. I had a friend that I met that was half Italian, half American, and she really helped me find the people I photographed in Rome. And there sort of was a domino effect that one friend would lead me to another person. But then I began realizing that Europeans marry other nationalities in Europe. So Italian one would say, oh, you have to meet my cousin who married an Austrian. And that was a domino effect for 8 years, I photographed in Europe, 6 different countries, and made that project called The Europeans.
Hey everyone, taking a quick break here to tell you a little bit about our Season 7 presenting sponsor, L'École School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison, Van Cleef, and Arpels. In addition to exhibitions, publications, research projects, and public events, L'École offers a range of courses led by experts across jewelry, craft, history, and the arts. With permanent campuses in both Paris and Hong Kong, L'École plans to open a 3rd space in Shanghai this year, and will soon open another in Paris, which will feature a public library of more than 7,000 reference works on jewelry and gems. At its main Paris space, L'École is also opening a gemothèque, or gem library, that contains some 1,200 stones for visitors to view and even handle. You can learn more about L'École and its current and upcoming offerings at www.l'ecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. And now, back to the episode. Okay, so zooming back in, you get married in 1966 at age 21. Then in 1973, you move with your husband and 2 young sons from New York City to Sun Valley, Idaho. Unbeknownst to you at the time, this move to Sun Valley will change your life forever. Tell me about your time there and also the Sun Valley Center for the Arts, how it shaped you as an artist.
Well, I owe my whole career to that move and my ex-husband's choice to go there. And not only was it the most fun you could ever imagine, but there was an art center there, and all the photographers that I've been looking at or maybe even bought work of would come there to teach. And sometimes there'd be 3 students in the class or 4. And that's where it all began, really. The whole subject matter of my work comes from, I think, the fact that I moved to a place in America that was so extraordinarily different from where I grew up. And as we started talking about each other, as you would if you were a student in college, the friends I had started realizing I came from a very different place than they did. And then I realized, oh, I guess I did. And then I'd go back in the summers and start photographing, and that's where that first black and white body of work from 1977 began.
And was it that the sort of nostalgia and melancholy we talked about, was that rooted in some of that Sun Valley?
Very much, because Sun Valley had nothing to do with that tradition or ritual. People were new, they came in, but there was also the color, the fabrics, the clothes people wore, the lack of age in the houses, and it just stood out more and more. I think also the gestures of how people stood, how they talked, how they walked, how they dressed. Granted, the times, that the fact it was the 70s made things very different, but it was more exaggerated there because it was really like going to college. And, the people my friends that I lived back east with, we were pretty grown up. We already had kids, even though we were just a couple of years older. We were like grown-ups. We had our own houses, et cetera.
I wanted to take a moment here for 1983, which is the year you divorced your husband and left Sun Valley. It's an important year in your life in so many ways, also because it was the year you started using a large format 4x5 after shooting with your 35 millimeter Pentax for so long. So what led you to the 4x5? Was there a sort of auspicious transition from like your divorce in your life to starting with this camera? How do you think about 1983?
Well, you're reading more into that. It had to do with Marclette, and that my teacher, who I admired, used a 4x5. And so I watched him and Ellen Manchester, the friends he had, who talked about photography day and night, talked about so many things that I'd never thought about, of the history of photography and the use of a view camera and what it did. And of course, I thought, well, I want to do that too. The bad part was I started using it just as I left Sun Valley, so I had to learn on my own. But it really had to do with Marclette using that camera.
And how do you think about the time with the 4x5? I mean, you're under this black curtain.
Well, first of all, everybody back in Rhode Island thought I was crazy because they had never seen a camera like that. And luckily, they got used to me, and that made it very difficult. Also, on top of that, I was very untechnical and always have been. And I struggled. But I knew what I wanted, and I've said this before. A lot of artists don't know what they want, and they might be technically proficient. I knew what I wanted. I just had to learn how to get it. And it took quite a while before I actually hired an assistant and had my first assistant. But my assistants have taught me the most that I know because I didn't have any teachers after that. So I started learning from them and learning about lighting. And that's really how it sort of dominoed and developed.
And your work, of course, starts getting noticed at this time. We mentioned the MoMA exhibition, but there were these two other sort of milestones in the 80s, amongst many. Your participation in the 1987 Whitney Biennial. And as far as I can tell, your first solo museum show, which was at the Denver Art Museum in 1989.
I think you skipped the most important thing after using the 4x5 was making a large photograph. And that happened again, just standing in that little dark room in Sun Valley, Idaho, in the mountains in the middle of nowhere, and a friend walking in and said, "Hey, Tina, you can make your pictures bigger." And she came from California. In Berkeley, I think there was a lab that could make them, 30 by 40 inches. But what's interesting about hearing that story is it sounds so very simple. But then you think about the first time that maybe Edison turned on a light bulb, or the person who invented the first wheel, or the first iPhone, and that first time, and was it as simple as something like that, as someone walking into a room and said, "Hey, you can do this." And it really happened like that. And so that has to do with technology. I think it has to do with Kodak making the paper big enough. And so I sent them to this lab in Berkeley where quite a few of us did. I think Richard Misrak did. And that was the beginning of that format and that fad and that revolutionary step in the history of photography. And making it on one big piece of paper. And then I found out one step later through Ann Tucker, who was the director of photography in Houston, that I could make them even bigger. So it's a very slow stepping stone, probably maybe a year in between those two different steps of one size of the paper, et cetera.
And what do you think that shift in size did to you as a person making pictures?
I think what it did was all the details in a room, all the things that I was curious about, the objects people collected, the paintings, the furniture, the flowers, all those details came out. And the room itself, the spaces, became such a part of the image, and besides the people. And technically, it was very difficult. Lots of mistakes, lots of blurry this and that. And I talk about my ratio because I'd like to say I might, at the height in the 1980s, 90s, that period, and don't forget, I'm talking about 1 month a year I would photograph. I would take at the most 400 sheets of film. That means 400 pictures. And then I realized I would have a show at Janet Borden every other year, and there'd be 9 pictures in that room. So that means, think about that, 9 pictures out of, let's say, 800 sheets of film. That's the ratio. Janet and I chose very carefully. We were very strict. There are hundreds of pictures that have never been seen and just not interesting, lying in file cabinets in a storage room. So anyway, I usually knew that the minute, though, I took the picture, whether it was a winner or not. And we only used Polaroid then. That was the only way we could see the result right away.
Tell me about 1990, that MoMA show. What was that like for you?
Of course, it was a thrill. And Catherine Evans was the curator. She was young. I can't remember what title she had, but she was the curator. It was almost too exciting to even believe. Really, very hard to believe. And, you know, I think it was just sort of a big moment. But MoMA would have these shows of new artists fairly often. It was wonderful. I mean, I wish they did that again. Well, maybe they do in some ways, but it was more often than I think that they do now. And it just was wonderful to be able to show these big pictures then.
We've touched on some of the exhibitions, but I also wanted to bring up your books. Theater of Manners from 1997, The Europeans from 2005, Players from 2011, and your Rizzoli monograph from 2017, and now The Beginning, your new book from Radius. How do you think about this trajectory, these books?
Well, anyone who has made a photography book knows what living, breathing hell it is. It is work beyond imaginable. But I was lucky enough to have met Walter Keller, who had a publishing company called Scalo in Germany. And he really was the first it guy for making photographs. And Gerhard Steidl was the man who printed the books. And that's where Gerhard started. So I got into that kind of niche. And once you're in there, it's sort of, you hope to be able to publish with that company as it goes on. But boy, it's not easy to do. I think it was an extraordinary experience. I mean, it's so terrible, though. You almost think, oh, God, I never want to do this again. And I'm not going to go into why it's so hard. It's just more work than anybody can possibly believe. But what is important is it really is the only record. Because if a viewer can't get to a gallery and you might not have a show, well, now we have the internet, which is great. But seeing an image on the internet, it's not the same as seeing it in a book. So the books really are the things that are going to sort of last through history.
Let's go to The Beginning, this new book, which, not to confuse listeners, is the title of the book, not the beginning of your time. But it is really at the root of your photography, and it's also the focus of this exquisite show that opened at Casman recently. What did it mean to you to put together this collection of 50-some early photos? And was it like staring back in time? How'd you go about selecting this particular group of pictures? Well,
what has been mentioned is that it was during COVID. I'm sitting in Rhode Island with my partner Bob and myself, and I'm thinking, okay, you know how you have to go into that closet and clean out your old clothes? Well, it was the same thing. I never would have gone in there through these 35 millimeter negatives if it hadn't been for COVID. And I did that very kind of quickly. I'm not the kind of person that sort of treasures things. I'm just bam, 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 quick like that. And then I scanned them, and then I met Todd Lippy. And that was sort of pivotal. And Todd Lippy was the publisher of a magazine called Esopus, a brilliant magazine that I can't even describe. It's so multi-layered. And he also designed books. And so I asked him if he would sort of make a dummy of these pictures, because otherwise there'd be no way of finding a publisher. And he made a dummy that was so fantastic without telling him one single thing about the people in the pictures, about anything really about myself. So we went about sort of trying to find a publisher for the book. And luckily, Spencer Bailey told me about Radius.
This is true.
Which I did not know.
First.
Which I did not know about. And it
helps to have a twin brother who also makes pictures.
All right. So thank you, brother. But that was a wonderful kind of segue. And I think that David Chickie, the editor and publisher of Radius, has made a book that's just wonderful, thoughtful to Todd and myself, and everything I could want.
And I have to also highlight here that it's a square format book, which is quite unusual. You don't see a lot of square format books.
Well, I didn't know that because the Rizzoli book was square too. I just like it. I like everything about it.
It's tricky to talk about photographs on a podcast, but I was hoping we might try to capture it here in words somehow, highlighting a few of the prints and their backstories that are in the book and the exhibition. I was hoping maybe we would start with the cover image, Water Slide in Fog, 1979. What made that cover worthy to you? Why is that image so special in your mind?
Well, first of all, to choose the cover really is agony because it's such a big decision. And David Chickie made some covers for me, but then I made some small ones that I think helped me a lot. But I think that photograph is really important to me because it's so strange. And it's sort of the kind of photograph I don't know if I could ever make again, just because of the geography of where that water slide was, how I was allowed to climb up this sort of dirt pyramid to get to the top, because I tried to go back last year and do it, and they wouldn't let me because everybody's afraid of being sued. And then the fact that I really will never really know what that photograph is about. The ideas I had at that time were so serious and dramatic. And I think it had a lot to do with being in workshops where people just beat themselves to death to try to talk about their work that's sort of thumbtacked to the wall, and being with photographers in the 70s that sort of were so angst-ridden and would have such dramatic sort of stories to tell about their photographs, or sort of ideas of what they wanted their photographs to be. And what I thought about that narrative was so dramatic that I didn't dare tell anybody. So I always kept that to myself. But now so much time has gone by that I thought, okay, this photograph is a miracle. I mean, I would never be able to make this again. It was where I was standing, what was going on, the fog, the color, the structure. My favorite part about the picture is the right bottom corner, that there is a square of grass that absolutely fascinates me. And it is a fascination to me because it is a phenomena that can happen only in the medium of photography, I think. And I'm not going to go more into that. I just want you all to go back to that picture and see if you think I'm crazy and why I was so overwhelmed by that little patch of green grass. I did think that the photograph seemed like the end of the world. It looked like something that might have come out of a movie like The Titanic or Force Majeure, that movie Force Majeure, which was so wonderful. And the color and the background that I love so much, the fog and the scale and the just fine line between what a little tiny 35 millimeter negative can capture from a photographer that had no idea what they were doing. I mean, it's just a miracle that those little people in the background and the cars are in focus. And the stuff that's happening on the left that happens to be on the back of the book, that to me is another fabulous picture in itself. And I could go on, but that's enough about that picture that I love to death.
There are two other pictures both from 1977, the suits and the twins that I wanted to bring up that are also an interesting pair and also fascinating on their own.
Well, now I kind of think, oh, God, those are so square and they're so perfect and they're so pasty white and clean. But what I was thinking about was not only the clothes that people wore on the East Coast, and this was before Ralph Lauren. I always like to point that out. But
a name that unfortunately has become all too synonymous with people writing about your work.
Well, if I don't, that makes sense. But I just want to point out that this is before Ralph Lauren. But, it had to do with the way that I dressed, the way my ex-husband dressed, and the guys that or the people we met in Sun Valley would just point it out, because no matter how much we tried to look like them, we somehow would look like East Coast. So not only the clothes that people wore, for instance, the seersucker suit that you would never see in the West Coast, or at least in Sun Valley, but the fact that someone's wearing a tie and a shirt. But also, more than that, the gestures of the hand in the pocket, the way someone holds a cigarette, that I think is handed down from generation to generation, of imitating subconsciously how your father stood, how your father held his hand, and then also the portraiture that's been handed down generation from generation through generations of whether some young child has looked at the photographs on the tables of their parents and subconsciously imitated what their great-grandfather was doing or wearing. So those pictures all come from that. And the way that you dress your twins alike. And maybe Spencer knows about that.
I loved seeing in the exhibition this contrast between your lives, like the Watch Hill life, the Sun Valley life, the New York life. And there's this print, Women on Fifth from 1976, and then Hot Tub from 1979. And they're presented, I think, next to each other or near each other. It just shows this contrast. And I was hoping you might speak to photographing in these three places and how different the experiences were between them.
I didn't think about that while I was photographing them. I think that, we would come back to New York for Christmas. I think that's when Women on Fifth was taken. That New York City is so much my home that was such a very traditional, typical scene, so that I would automatically photograph it. And the hot tub scene really was one of those situations. I mean, we would go to hot tubs and people would take their clothes off so often that it was like, oh, ho hum, it was no big deal. But it was, again, one of those situations where people would be together, which I longed for, just I needed subject matter. I think that the fact that it was a hot tub and that people don't have their clothes on was just so normal at that point. It wasn't when we first got there. We were pretty shocked, but it was so normal that it was okay, let's just try it again. Try another photograph.
Let's end on Amy, Phil, and Brian from 1980. This is a photograph you've spoken about at length, but it's so beautifully staged. It's the swimming pool scene. And I was hoping you might just speak to the time you spent making that picture and directing the people in that picture, which is an interesting element of it.
Are you asking me how much time I took to take that picture?
Not how much time.
Do you know what 125th of a second is?
Not how much time, but no, the time kind of spent setting it up and how you visualized that striking scene.
Well, it wasn't like that. I was taking probably quite a few random, pretty casual pictures. And then it wasn't that I was thinking hard about it, believe me. But it was basically, how kids are insanely running around a pool, jumping, crashing, just saying, hey, Phil, hold still there. Amy, you sit up there. Brian, hold still there. It was like that. I mean, it was boom, boom, boom. That's all. Very quick, very fast. I mean, obviously later, I rarely took very long time to direct people. No matter what picture you're thinking about, all the pictures you're thinking about, if any picture I've ever done, it's boom, 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 like that. It's fast.
I now can imagine you on a fashion shoot.
Very fast. And then I have to wait for the other people. But let me just think about that. Oh, I actually, at that time, I did quite a few pictures that were very sterile like that. Very structured, something down the middle, something on each side. And they're just all in the garbage can because I knew they were boring. So, I kept that one just because it was maybe more interesting than the other ones. But it took a long time, and it had to do with the technical part of you need more light to have the speed of having someone move and putting the camera on a tripod. I mentioned that. Eventually, I put my camera on a tripod to slow things down. So anyway, that one sort of got saved. Yeah, made the cut.
So to finish, you dedicate the book to Bob, as in Bob Liebrick, who you mentioned, an architect, your late partner, who I was lucky enough to meet. And I was hoping you might just speak a little bit about him here, share who he was and what it means to you to dedicate the book to him.
Wow. Well, I met Bob because he was our architect when I had just had Phil. Phil was born in 1969, so let's say 1968. We met him through the interior decorators that were friends of my mother's that my mother worked with and then who helped us. And we lived in the inn that my ex-husband grew up in. And that is now the oldest house in Watch Hill, a 1778 house. And Bob came in and totally gutted the entire middle of the house. And I think I was so young and so out of it and dealing with my kids that I had no idea that he was going to gut the whole middle of the house out till it actually happened. There's a skylight going down the middle of the house and a couple of other things. The house is very much also kept in the way it was from 1778. So he was our architect. We then moved to Sun Valley. I never saw him again. And in 1991, I think, I was asked to do a project at the Whitney Museum. I was doing a lecture. At the end of the lecture, this white-haired man came up and introduced himself, and Bob had black hair when I met him, and I didn't recognize him. I was divorced at that time in 1990 when I re-met him again, and we started going out then. And we stayed together till he died last year. And he would have been 90 years old a couple of weeks after he died.
And an interesting thing I found out in researching for this interview was that he was actually once your photography assistant.
Oh, well, can you still hear the screaming? When we went to the Academy in Rome the first year, I didn't have an assistant. And so he helped me set up the lights for some of the most important pictures I've ever made. But boy, there was a lot of screaming because he kept on arguing with me. But he did. He survived, and he did help me. Yeah. Good for you to, I don't know where, maybe I said that at some point.
I guess to close this out, is there a picture you haven't taken yet that you've always wanted to take? How do you think about where you're at in this rich body of work you've built?
Well, I am making a new body of work now with my 8x10, and there's still life without people. And I'm really loving it because I can take much more time than I've ever taken before. And I think that the speed in which I talk about photographing has to do with not wanting to bother people and not wanting to annoy them by keeping them too long. And so now I don't have to do that. So that's exciting me. And I guess you could say they're almost abstract. So if I'm pleased with those, which I'm pretty strict with myself, that will be exciting to go on with that. So I think that there are things that I would like to do. And then, I'm still interested in film making and video, which are hell to work with, but there are things still out there.
Tina, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is a pleasure.
Thank you.
Extra thanks to our Season 7 presenting sponsor, L'École School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef & Arpels. A unique place for learning, L'École welcomes the general public to the world of jewelry through courses, conferences, exhibitions, videos, and book publications. You can find out more about L'École at www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. And thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of Time Sensitive on our website, timesensitive.fm, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow us on Instagram at slowdown.tv. And if you like our programs, please be sure to subscribe and leave comments. Our theme music was composed by Billy Martin. This episode was produced by Ramon Broza, Emily Zhang, and Johnny Simon.